prepare yourselves for a very different service. So, opening words this morning, we of course have 4 speakers speaking about beauty. And I thought, boy, one more poem about beauty or wise word is probably just one too many. So I thought I'd go a different direction. Improbably, I was on BuzzFeed, and they had an article on 32 of the most beautiful words in the English language. And then they had a bunch of comments where people were arguing which the most beautiful words were. Of course, because people have opinions, including myself. So I took the most beautiful words in general, and I added some of the comments from the people and deleted a few from the original list. The concept of beauty, as we think of it this morning, is cultural, gender-based, intellectual, emotional, ineffable. We don't know what it is, but we know that the sounds of words, regardless of their meanings, can hold beauty. Rudyard Kipling reminds us that words, of course, are the most powerful drug used by humankind. So, listen carefully. Here we go. And these are in no particular order. A quiver, mellifluous, ineffable, nefarious, somnambulous, epic, sonorous, serendipity, luminance, bombinate, ethereal, illicit, petrichor. That's the smell of earth after rain, and how nice that we have that today. And that was a new word for me. I didn't know that word. Iridescent, epiphany, what you will experience after we all talk today. Things go well. Supine, luminescence, solitude, aurora, syzygy, which is what the rose galaxies are in relation to each other. Eclectic, oblivion, ephemeral, incandescent. Denouement, halcyon, wanderlust, eloquence, defenestration. That's when you push someone out a window. Diaphanous, effervescence, and another one that was new for me, cromulent, appearing legit but spurious, perhaps like these opening words. This morning is a very special service. We have 4 speakers who will speak to us about beauty. We have Graham Nell, Catherine Nicholson, John Biasucci, and myself. And each of us will share some thoughts as we move through the service.
Good morning. What should I say? Beautiful day to you. Not the rain beautiful?
Yes.
I was asked to speak about the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I set out to look at things, or the idea, through the mind and the eyes of an artist. I've always seen myself as a person always searching for the inner meaning, the real truth. And this has repeatedly landed me in the hot seat. Through the struggle, I've come to see the world through eco-feminist eyes, and have very seldom held back in expressing that point of view. Okay, so what is beauty? Is it only in the eyes of the beholder? If so, is it purely a personal response? When one talks about beauty, a term almost overused without much deeper consideration, it's a beautiful day. That's a beautiful flower. What a beautiful person. That's a beautiful sound. All seem to reflect a personal emotional response. And often there's a combination of senses involved: hearing, smelling, seeing, tactile feeling. Is it just emotion, or is there an intellectual response as well? One has an emotional response to sound. For me, the sound of an oboe just takes hold of me. I'm sucked into its pure, beautiful note sounds. Yes, a level of intellectual response is there. However, one loses oneself into beauty on an instinctual, almost hypnotic way. And all humans have this capability. Okay, so we all have the sense of the concept of beauty. And we have this from a very early age. And I believe we spend our lives slowly whittling away, evolving, and building up each our own sense of beauty. Gombrich, an art critic and a British socialist of the 60s, saw beauty only through the window of socialism. And I'm sure Stephen Harper sees beauty looking down on Royal Pikeman. Yet, the sense of beauty seems also to have a generational slant. In the 60s, my father threatened to disown me if he ever saw me wearing flower shirt. And of course, I promptly went out and bought one. Considering the shirt to be the coolest and the most beautiful thing I could wear. My father never disowned me. So the sense of beauty is also affected by different values, religious point of views, one's upbringing, one's culture, one's political point of view, one's gender. I believe the sense of beauty is a very essential part of us being intellectual and conscious human beings. Our sense of beauty is a driving force in life. We seek, we yearn for emotional revelry and intellectual release. Beauty is so tied to our sexual, emotional, and chemistry that one's whole life affects one's sense and appreciation of our own interpretation and evolution of what is beautiful. Soldiers that first came across the surviving Holocaust victims were amazed that even in those dire conditions, they still managed to express the beauty they saw in the rescuing Allied soldiers and were able to release a smile and express what a beautiful day it was for them. So to say what has been the most beautiful emotion that I have been able to intellectualize or experience has taken lots of mind racking. I know that I'm brought to tears by things, human experience stories of endurance, compassion, of determinants against all odds for the betterment of the earth, humanity, and all living things. And I find this incredibly beautiful. I think all people do in one form or other. I find the wind beautiful. Storms, waves, ocean spray, the surge of waves crashing against the rocks, trees whipping and bending, trees crashing down, branches flying everywhere. I'd be completely absorbed, intellectual and emotional, all intertwined. My goodness me, that is beauty in action. I've a rescued rhododendron from Bill Reed's daughter's old garden. The scent is so incredibly beautiful and overpowering that I found myself defending this amazing plant. All who smell it take a snippet, to the point it looks bonsai. Bonsai plants. Now there's a sense of beauty. The beauty lies in the sense that less is more. I love both. The clutter of objects, shapes and sizes, different shapes, different colors, buttons, the color mix of Smarties. Yet I find that I have an emotional beauty response to the simple line of the horizon, or a wide open sky, an empty room, and just silence. Being alone with one's thoughts, uninterrupted. These are also beautiful. The whole notion that an artist's sole occupation should be one of revealing beauty, to stimulate that sense of beauty in each of us. I'll go along with this, but more in the sense that an artist, poet, writer, philosopher gives us license to dig deeper into our own sense of life's beauty. Really a luxury when one considers the horror and absolute tragedy of some people's lives. So I always have a deep sense of gratitude and a sense of honor when I find myself in the middle of an emotional response to beauty. A response that connects me to the past and to the future of human experience. To single out one beautiful thing, I'd say it is all in the intricacies of this earth, its healings and its manifestations, to be the most beautiful in our eyes, in my life. Thank you.
I feel like Graham said it all, and I'm not sure what to say now. That was really beautifully articulated. Graham, thank you. Seek and he shall find. I guess what I believe is that we choose. We choose joy, we choose to look for beauty in our life. And I know that we live in a very wonderful environment and we live in a privileged way in this world. But I also think that one can choose to look at the world and find the things that are beautiful, like those survivors of the Holocaust. And that's always informed the way I live my life. I think we're part of a society obsessed with appearances, with perfection, and in our culture, the predominant idea of beauty seems to have become synonymous with artificial, superficial enhancements and adornments, in particular of the human body, but also of house and garden and even our pets. I like to use the word aesthetic sustenance. I coined that phrase when I was reading my master's, my thesis in counseling and music therapy, because I found that when I was working in the cancer agency that music had an extraordinary power, an extraordinary influence to help people through really tough experiences of pain or anxiety. And you know, I had worked as a nurse before, and as a nurse I had tasks. As a music therapist, I wasn't quite sure of what I was doing because all I seemed to be bringing was music. And yet, to some extent, the music was me, but it also was the music that I made available to people, either because I was bringing it myself, or I had an example that I wanted to share with you of a young man who was in the bone marrow transplant unit. And the nurse particularly asked me to go in because he was a percussion player, a drummer, and he was a professional drummer playing world music, and she thought he especially would like the music therapist to visit. He had a very dreadful sarcoma in his leg such that he was waiting for his leg to be amputated. It was very, very painful, painful even to touch for the sheet to be on his leg. I went into the room and I introduced myself, and he looked at me and he just went, I don't think so. And so I left. I never stayed if I thought that it wasn't something in a way that I could be helpful. But as I was going out the door, he said, unless you have any Miriam Makeba. And I said, well, actually I do. So I went back to my office. I got the CD of Miriam Makeba, who's a wonderful singer from Africa. And I brought it back, and I had a Discman, and I put the earphones on him, and I turned it on, and he lay back on his pillow, and he said, oh my God, that's what I needed. And I thought, you know, for him, the next day when I went in, he was a different person. He was sitting up in bed. He had asked his wife to bring in his drums. She had her guitar. I came in with my guitar. And we were playing, and people were standing around the door, nurses and patients alike. So, did it heal his sarcoma? No. But did it heal his spirit for that time when he needed it so badly? Yes, it did. And so I became aware slowly as I did my practice of music therapy when I was at the cancer agency of the power of music, aesthetic sustenance. And I find that through art, and music especially for me. But there are moments where music and art and architecture, things like that, where I'm looking at something or listening to something that takes my breath away, replenishes my soul. And beauty in nature, too. The sunshine sparkling on the water up at our cabin, the delicacy of a butterfly, the majesty of an eagle in flight, or watching sea otters play in the ocean just in front of our cabin. I always have trouble figuring out what to say when I'm asked to do something like this. So I ended up going on the computer and typing in quotes, poems about beauty. And what I came up with, finally, the only thing that appealed to me was a beautiful poem by Wordsworth. And the reason why it touched me is because I just recently was hiking in Wales. And this particular poem is called Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey. And I was a few miles above Tintern Abbey hiking. I actually hiked 75 miles over 6 days through the countryside of Wales. It was just stunningly beautiful. The weather was beautiful. I was in through pastures, walking amongst cows and up on ridges looking at gorgeous views, and it was amazing. But so I decided that I wanted to read this poem to you because, like Andy was saying, the use of words that some of these poets and the way they put them together is so beautiful. And when I read this, I thought, That's what I saw. That's what I saw. How oft in spirit have I turned to thee, O sylvan Wye? The river Wye was what I was looking at from the ridge down. Thou wanderer through the woods, how often has my spirit turned to thee? This is, by the way, excerpts from this poem because it's very long. Once again do I behold these steep and lofty cliffs that on a wild, secluded scene connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. Once again I see these beauteous forms, hedgerows, little lines of sportive wood run wild, pastoral farms, green to the very door, and wreaths of smoke sent up in silence from among the trees. And oft, in lonely rooms amid the din of towns and cities, I have owed to them, in hours of weariness, sensations sweet, felt in the blood and felt along the heart, a tranquil restoration. And to them I have owed another gift of aspect more sublime, that blessed mood in which the burden of the mystery, in which the heavy and the weary weight of all this unintelligible world is lightened. The soul made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy we see into the life of things. I think I'm going to leave it there.
Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, we've heard many, many times. And we've agreed with it many, many times. Maybe it's that garish color the neighbor painted their house. How could they have picked that color? Or a garish tattoo that someone so proudly displays on the street. How could they do that to their body? Yes, it seems beauty is totally subjective. It's in the eye of the beholder. To each his own, to each her own. Well, it was not always that way. If we go back to the Greeks, Plato put beauty right up there with his other major forms. That's that transcendent reality beyond and far more important than our everyday realities, like justice, goodness, wisdom, and beauty, objective. And like so much of Plato's doctrines, that view held sway for many centuries after Plato. People sought objective understanding of that objective truth of beauty. They sought for a golden ratio. They looked for the perfect proportions in classical buildings and classical statues. But by, I would say, 16th, 17th century, 18th century, certainly with the rise of the British empiricists and Enlightenment thinking, experience became the source of truth. You looked for the perceiver of the experience, the beholder. So that by 1757, we have David Hume, perhaps the greatest of the Enlightenment thinkers, British empiricists, saying this: beauty is no quality in things themselves. It exists merely in the mind which contemplates them. And each mind perceives a different beauty. So it's quite understandable that, say, 120 some years later, 1878, according to my internet research on the source of this quote, we find Margaret Wolfe Hungerford, an Irish playwright, or novelist I should say, writing into her novel for the very first time, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But of course there's other views. Some feel that whatever is in the eye of the beholder or the mind of the beholder has been put there by society, our culture. but we've been brainwashed into believing or thinking about beauty. Ever since birth, we've been inundated by advertising and cultural gender stereotypes, and that's what we think of as beauty. And certainly, when I think of what my abs are supposed to look like, or I think of what the ideal, ultra-thin fashion model ideal that women are supposed to look like, I think there's some truth to that, certainly. But evolution, too, I think, can shed some light on beauty. See, Darwin's evolution by natural selection, when he first proposed it in his 1859 book, Origin of Species, met with quite a bit of pushback. People said, well, it may be true that plants evolved by natural selection, or that other animals than humans evolved, but not humans. Humans have powers, traits that animals never have. Power of reason, and specifically, people said, a sense of beauty. So here's Darwin writing in 1879 in his later book, The Descent of Man, and in that gender insensitive aging, and of course, Descent of Humans. This sense of beauty has been declared to be peculiar to man. But when we behold male birds elaborately displaying their plumes in splendid colors before the females, whilst other birds, not thus decorated, make no such display, it's impossible to doubt that the females admire the beauty of their male partners. And he pointed out that this explained the puzzle of enlightenment. Puzzle of evolution. The peacock's beautiful tail. It's cumbersome. It's a dead giveaway to predators. How can this give an advantage in the struggle for survival? Well, it attracts the ladies. See, it's not just surviving that counts, according to Darwin. It's surviving and having reproductive success. Having an advantage in the sexual selection game. And then we have, therefore, Steven Pinker writing in 2002. Steven Pinker is an eminent evolutionary psychologist from MIT. Says this: an eye for beauty locks onto faces that show signs of health and fertility, just as one would predict if it had evolved to help the beholder find the fittest mate. So then, our taste for beauty may be grounded in our genes. You thought it was love at first sight. It was really just your genes talking. But it's something. It's not just a matter of a pretty face or a handsome body that is an evolutionary advantage. So we have Dennis Dutton, a professor of philosophy from New Zealand, writing in 2000, he's the late actually, but writing in 2009, his book, The Art Instinct. And he has a wonderful TED Talk given in 2010, very popular TED Talk, millions have viewed it. His thought was that human tastes in all things beautiful, not just physical beauty, but in creating beauty, in the ability to create an object of beauty, to weave a wonderful basket, to chip a arrowhead in a perfect way, evidenced to the world that one had intelligence, had motor skills, hand motor skills, could plan, and it was an advantage. And also the ability to appreciate those skills and the beauty that others could create was an advantage. And this was a virtuous cycle, so that people's desire to create beauty and ability to appreciate beauty has evolved over the years, and so it's a very powerful, very force in our lives. Well, I'm not going to try to pick a winner among these different theories of beauty, whether it's totally objective, Plato thought, or totally subjective, or culturally determined, or evolutionarily based, or maybe some of all of that. I want to end with just a memory that I have from over 40 years ago. I was in New York City visiting one of the very first times that the treasures of Tutankhamun, King Tut, were on display in North America at the Metropolitan Museum. I remember Tutankhamun was that Egyptian pharaoh of 1330, around 1330 BC, 3,300 years ago. And I remember looking at that magnificent display of fabulously carved jewelry and this golden funereal mask and these lovely figurines and thinking, a lot has happened in 3,300 years and we've learned a lot, but the human ability to design and create and to appreciate beauty was just as evolved and astounding 3,300 years ago as it is now.
Well, I put myself last because I figured, well, you're running the service, you'll adjust, knowing that I had 3 incredible speakers ahead of me who would cover all the salient issues about beauty, and I would be like a withered fourth. So I thought, I'll be contrarian, and those of you who know me aren't terribly surprised. So I'm going to talk about beauty and the woman, and discuss beauty as it pertains to women as shackles. Asked why people desire physical beauty, Aristotle said, no one who is not blind could ask that question. And as we've heard this morning already, the word beauty has multiple meanings. I think, John, you did a great job summarizing historically how we have bounced all over the place. So I took a look in dictionaries. Because I just had to rewrite this on Thursday when I got John's, when I finally got the rest of the titles, and I thought, okay, time to recalibrate. In Merriam-Webster, the first one is the quality of being physically attractive. That is their first definition for beauty. And the third one is a beautiful woman. In the Cambridge Dictionary, the first one is an attractive quality that gives pleasure to those that experience it or think about it, or a person who has an attractive quality. And the example they give, at 37, she was known as a great beauty. And then the Oxford English Dictionary, their first definition is the quality of a person, especially a woman, who is highly pleasing to sight, perceived physical perfection, attractive, harmony of features, figure or complexion, exceptional grace, elegance, or charm in appearance. I was immediately depressed. We rarely call a man beautiful, and men are very seldom required to use beauty products or to take heed to beauty tips. In fact, we have whole sections of stores and pharmacies, and in fact, entire stores dedicated to improving the beauty of women. How do I know this? I partake. I know, not much happens, but still. So indeed, as women, we are often, and this is true and sad, valued most for our looks. Some scientists argue that what men perceive as beauty in women is for genetic survival, exactly as John discussed, and not the tattered remnants of patriarchy. But I disagree, because throughout history, beauty as it pertained to women has largely been cultural and political, as well as primal and genetic, but not solely primal and genetic. In 1991, Naomi Wolf, author of The Beauty Myth, wrote that, quote, beauty is a currency system, like the gold standard. Like any economy, it is determined by politics, and in the modern age in the West, it is the last best belief system that keeps male dominance intact. And notice I'm quoting almost all women, this is interesting. Dr. Nancy Etkoff, Harvard medical faculty member, said, racism and class snobbery are reflected in images of beauty. Although beauty itself is indifferent to race, and thrives on diversity. In other words, our standards of beauty as they pertain to women tend to be racist, cultural, subjective, regressive, and repressive, and largely unobtainable, because that's the point. The few of us that can be it, the more precious or the more special it is. Back to ancient Greece, John, thank you for the segue. Women were actually seen as deformed men. We could never be as beautiful as a man. Well, that right away puts us at the end of the line, right? And I know those of you that went to Greece, I went when I was 15, and of course it was my first view of naked men. I loved it. All the statues are naked men. It's awesome because that was considered the physical ideal. And the women, if you recall, are largely draped in cloth. Okay, they are largely not nude. And that was about the last time that happened, and we went back to all the women being nude, and now you'll notice almost all nudity is female in painting, sculpture, and so forth, and almost all men are depicted clothed. I will not go on, but I could give you lots of examples. Okay, so in other words, our standards for beauty are cultural. China. In ancient China, of course, beauty looked Chinese, but again, you could hardly obtain it. You needed to be pale and very slender with tiny little feet. And if you were wealthy enough, you would bind those feet so you could barely walk. You would be deformed. But that was exquisite beauty, and of course, you couldn't easily bear children or work in the fields and have those big splayed out. Those of us who have babies know you gain a size on your foot or maybe two just from the weight of the baby, right? So little tiny feet. I remember once being in Hong Kong on business and breaking a heel, and I had to buy new pair of high heels. And I'm a very small person, and the days I was even smaller in those days. And I went in to buy these shoes, and the woman carefully measured my foot to sell me this pair of shoes, and she actually went like this. Because it was like I had a giant wart on my nose. From her perspective, the size of my foot compared to the size of my body was just way out of line. And honestly, you guys, I have normal-sized feet. So, in Japan, if you look at a kimono and the sit of the collar, it reveals the nape of the neck. This was considered one of the most erotic parts of the female body. I mean, it was like cleavage. And then we go to the Western Renaissance. And as you look and think in your mind about all the beauties, think Botticelli, think Leonardo da Vinci. Of course, most of his women look like men with lemons for boobs, but that's a different issue. If you can, I mean, you guys know I went to school in Florence instead of Renaissance art, anyway, different. So you look at that, and they have high foreheads, very blonde, very pale, ginormous breasts, and full hips. And that was considered beauty. It's the opposite of the Asian standard for beauty at that time. Then we get to the 60s, which John also referred to, Twiggy. And all of a sudden, beauty was British, and beauty was very British looking, very flat-chested, straight-figured, boyish, prepubescent, really, with interesting eye makeup. And that's, at Marilyn Monroe, in just a couple of decades, was out. Too full-figured, too flabby, really, and honestly, size 14. And yet we go to Africa. So think of all these different cultural norms. This is clearly not a standard of beauty. We go to Africa, and women are famously full-figured. And in fact, when you get married, you really make an effort before you get married to put on as much weight as possible. I know when I got married, I made every effort to lose as much weight as possible. I think that's still true. One blogger said, growing up in rural Nigeria, a woman was considered beautiful if she carried extra weight around her chest, and most importantly, around her rear end. He used a different word, I changed it. The complexion should be very dark, and the hair needs to be braided at least once a week. Women are still judged largely by their looks. Are our beauty standards for women sexist? In the words of one of my favorite authors, Caitlin Moran, who wrote How to Be a Woman, she's like a 36 crazy-ass journalist, funny woman. To determine if something is essentially sexist, she says, ask yourself, are the men doing it? In the US, breast implants, $300,000 a year. Thin thigh liposuction, $200,000 a year. Flat stomach, tummy tuck, $111,000 a year. We don't keep track in Canada of those procedures, but we do keep track of this. Canadians in 2005 had 126,000 filler injections and 142,000 Botox injections. According to the Medicard findings, the typical injection recipient is a female resident of Ontario, British Columbia, and Quebec. Cosmetic surgery, women account for 87% of the market. Essentially, the men aren't doing it. The human sculptures created in ancient Greece, as John referred to the architecture, also were derived from golden mean proportions for the human body, including the human face. And these were called the canons. And this was refined by Leonardo da Vinci during the Renaissance, who proposed there were certain proportions or certain distance of eyes, shape, that made beauty. And then Albert Dürer, who's another artist 100 years later, he refined this, and he said, yes, it'll be a third of the forehead, a third of the nose, and a third of the mouth and the chin. And in addition to Leonardo's measurements, and in addition to the Greek golden facial and body mean. So, our own Dr. Leslie Farkas, who's working for at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, does corrective surgery, and he thought he would study this because he is an anthropomorphic facial morphology expert. And what does that mean? It means that when he does plastic surgery for people who have been burn victims or have terrible deformities, he wants to do it in a way that creates the proportion that's appropriate to the face. It's extremely delicate. So I was reading some of these guys' publications. I am telling you, very detailed. You can look it up, but it is data-a-rama. But the upshot of it is this. He used the North American white face as the norm, and his objective was to establish normative data to use for plastic surgeons for all different ethnicities and all different faces, using that as the norm, and everything deviates from that. In one of his studies, he measured the facial proportions of 200 women. 50 were models. And he asked a large sample of participants to rate their attractiveness, both men and women. And then he compared the results to the conventions of the canon. What were the perfect proportions? The canon didn't fare well. Many of the measurements did not turn out to be important, such as the relative angles of the eyes to the ears and the nose. None of the faces or heads in profile corresponded at all to the equal halves or thirds or fourths that had been proposed. And in fact, you won't be surprised by this, but it's dramatically different by ethnicity. So beauty clearly is not universal. What people thought was beautiful was more subjective and more aligned with their inherent ethnicity. An example would be African and Asian faces have wider noses. Arab and Greek faces, and you guys know I'm part Greek and part Turkish, right, have longer noses, including me. I mean, think of Nefertiti. Think of the Greek sculptures, very straight. Nobody's turning up, believe me. I wanted a turned up nose my whole life, never happened. So our definition of beauty, though, I believe, is beginning to change. And I think this is largely due to women having more power in our societies and reclaiming female sexuality, as well as the interconnectedness of our global populations, where we begin to appreciate beauty in different ethnicities with different looks. Women of the so-called Western world now are, I mean, think of the old days, we had to pretend we were sexless. Now we can freely oogle men or women. I do it on a regular basis. At the very thought of sex, we no longer need to faint and cross our legs. Magic Mike, anyone? Women and men are casting off the young, chaste virgin ideal of beauty. We see women taking charge of their bodies, and we see many different types of bodies. Female beauty is now expressed as Latina, Jennifer Lopez, African American, Beyonce, Armenian Arab, Kim Kardashian, European Scarlett Johansson. Ektof says, 20 or 30 years ago, if you got dressed up, it was simply to please men, or it was something you were doing because society demanded it. Women and feminists today, and I would add men also, by the way, I mean, most of the men sitting right out here today are feminists. In fact, Graham described himself as an ecofeminist, and I totally agree. We see how we look as our own choice, And this maybe becomes an effective tool for our own liberation, for liberating the shackles of beauty to be a different way of experiencing beauty. But until we recognize that standards of beauty, as they refer to women, are still globally largely patriarchal and objectifying, we will remain mired in our inequality. Women paid less for the same work, higher percentage of women living in poverty, women of underrepresented business, government, science, leadership positions, society's effort to control women's sexuality, genital mutilation, restrictions on access to birth control, religious misogyny. We as a culture must learn to value women and all people, not mainly for their physical beauty, although we will always be attracted to physical beauty. Trophy wives and girlfriends, trophy girlfriends gotta go. When Eleanor Roosevelt, a very accomplished American First Lady and person in her own right, was asked if she had any regrets, her response was, she wished she had been prettier. This statement is especially ironic and demonstrative of the oppressive power of our standards of beauty, because Eleanor Roosevelt also wrote, when you adopt the standards and values of someone else, you surrender your own integrity. You become, to the extent of your surrender, less of a human being.